Hello, welcome to Skyview Concert Hall. I am Ashley Johnson.
I'm Gregg Scholl, trombonist in the Vancouver Symphony. Welcome to Da Capo.
So this weekend, we've got a really big one. We're doing Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, and it's a very interesting sort of cryptic piece, isn't it?
That's true. If you look up Shostakovich 10 on Wikipedia, for instance, the first thing you're told is this article, and it's a short article. This article has multiple issues. It needs additional certification and verification. And now we are talking, really, because Shostakovich symphonies are not these obscure pieces of work that he put out.
Right.
They're pretty big and famous and important. But there's just not a lot written about the 10th Symphony. The first thing that the Wikipedia article says after that big disclaimer is, no one really knows when this piece was written. Dmitri Shostakovich himself said it was 1953, but other people have corrected him and said it was in 1951. There's sketches of the 10th Symphony material that go all the way back to 1946. And instead of the usual part of a scholarly article or a Wikipedia article where they start explaining the history and the thematic content and all these things that you need to know about a piece, it goes from that disclaimer, it says no one knows when this was written, and then immediately it goes right into the instrumentation of the piece. This is for this many violins and that type of stuff. So the usual content just is not there.
Bizarre. Well, if we don't know much about the context of the work, at least we have the work itself. So how about we begin by talking about the form?
So the form of the piece is in 4 movements, a very traditional way of writing a symphony: moderato, allegro, allegretto, andante. The tempo indications are the only descriptions of the movements, which is not super unusual, although it's a little bit of a less than modern approach, especially for something that was debuted in the second half of the 20th century.
If we don't have much information from Shostakovich himself, there must at least be some commentary on the work.
There's a little bit of stuff out there, and so a lot of people will describe this piece upon hearing it as something like, this piece is 48 minutes of tragedy, despair, terror, violence, and then at the end there's 2 minutes of triumph. And this has led people to decide that the piece must be about Stalin, and it must be about the defeat of Stalin and the end of that period of time in Russia. And Shostakovich himself played into that description, but after the fact. In later years, he said, "But I did depict Stalin in music in my next symphony, the 10th. I wrote it right after Stalin's death, and no one has yet guessed what the symphony is about. It's about Stalin and the Stalin years." Now, he wrote that in his memoir, which appeared at a time when Shostakovich's reputation in the West was sort of at a low, and painting his 10th Symphony as an indictment of Stalin could only help to improve that situation. The truth is there's a lot more to this symphony, but a lot of composers had abandoned it until Shostakovich started talking about it.
So it's notable for having quite a long first movement. It's about half the length of the whole piece.
That's right. The first movement is by far the longest one in Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, and the truth is there's not much written about it. We don't know that much about it. In some ways, that first movement has all the cards that you expect Shostakovich to deal out on the table. There's very intense music. There's these gut-wrenching sort of emotionally wrought climaxes. There's an ominous military drum that also comes back later in the piece. There's some shrieking piccolos and other woodwinds. You can tell as soon as you hear this music that we are in Dmitri Shostakovich land, and it has that filigree that all his music has, which is the sound of a person coming unhinged. But nobody really knows or has said much about any other content for this first movement, and it sort of stands as this more abstract example of his writing style.
So saying that there's not much on the first movement would imply there may be more about the second movement.
That's true, and the second movement follows a more established form, especially for Shostakovich, of doing things. What we end up with is this loud and fast sort of scherzo with lots of syncopated rhythms and 16th note passages, much more dance-like, as opposed to the first movement, which is much more of a question mark. Suddenly, we're still sounding like Shostakovich, but we're playing a dance form. It's the second movement of the piece. Here's the scherzo, and let's go.
And then what about the third movement?
When we get to the third movement of Shostakovich 10, we start to see him dive even deeper into his bag of tricks and secret techniques and codes that he used in other pieces as well. And so the violas start off a theme that is built around 4 notes, D, C, B, and E flat. This is a very important succession of notes because if you spell the names of those notes in German, it comes out D, C, H, S, and that is the first initial of Dmitri Shostakovich's name, as well as the first 3 letters of his last name in German. And so what he's doing is inserting his own moniker into the music, and he used this D, C, H, S theme, these 4 notes, in other different pieces as well. And so this is something that you can only really appreciate reading it or something like that. You wouldn't necessarily notice that this was going on while you listened to this piece.
Mm-hmm. So are there any other hidden secrets?
There's another theme that was eventually discovered by a Shostakovich scholar, a woman named Nellie Kravitz. And in this second part of the third movement, we get another theme, E, A, E, D, A. These are pitches that are presented in succession. And if you call notes by their solfege names, so solfeggio is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, this sort of international way of describing notes of pitches, what those notes come out into is E, la, mi, re, a. And if you spell that out in writing, you get the name Elmira. And this is a theme that is presented in this third movement. Well, Elmira Nazarova was a student of Dmitri Shostakovich, and this was a person with whom he fell in love. And this theme presents this really ambiguous tonality of uncertainty and hollowness. It sounds very abstract and strange. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about the music of Shostakovich. He takes some personal experience, translates it into some kind of musical code, creates a theme, and then integrates it into a symphonic work, and never explains it to anybody.
So did Elmira know that she was hidden in the music here?
You are helping me correct myself. He did explain it to somebody. He explained it to her. He wrote her a letter and he discussed the Elmira theme and how he was going to put it together. And in fact, he compared it to Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde, which was a piece that he was really listening to a lot about this time. Now, Mahler composed that piece following this really painful period in his life, and the song that Mahler wrote addresses things like the pain of living and parting and salvation and all these heavy themes. Leonard Bernstein, by the way, called that piece Mahler's greatest symphony. Well, in the Elmira theme, we find the same sort of sequence of notes, and they're presented by the horn in both pieces. So this was unknown until much later, after this piece had already entered the repertoire, that this secret theme was in it as well, not just the Dmitri Shostakovich personal theme.
So what about the fourth movement?
When we get to the fourth movement, we have this very slow andante introduction, and this segues right away into a quick allegro, and the DSCH theme is again rattled out. It's played some more. By the time we get to the end of the movement, we have a transition into E major, which is the triumphant key sounding ending to this piece. And you even have some pretty wild techniques of glissando. Instruments are swooping up and down from a low E up to a E an octave above.
So I see you've got a couple of books there.
Yes, I brought these books with me today because I'm a person that is very interested in Shostakovich as well as certain aspects of Russian history. And I thought that our viewers might be interested in checking out a couple of these books because they are great. The first one is called Leningrad, Siege and Symphony by Brian Moynihan. This is a fantastic read about the siege of Leningrad. During that time, Shostakovich remained in Leningrad. He wrote his Seventh Symphony. Then he left, and it became almost a military operation to get the music out of Russia. It's a fascinating story, as well as a historical account of what was going on in Leningrad during World War II. And that reminded me of another great book that is Russian in nature. It's not about Shostakovich, but this is called The Lost Pianos of Siberia by Sophie Roberts. And this is a fascinating book about the country of Siberia and how in the 1800s it was extremely rare and difficult to have a piano, let alone a grand piano, anywhere in that country. And it just so happens that some of the pianos that originally came to certain towns in Siberia are still there, but nobody knows very much about them. And this author went over there and started exploring around to find these instruments. It's a fascinating story about how pianos got into Russia and what happened to them after they were there.
Well, thank you for the recommendations. I'm so looking forward to hearing this very mysterious piece this weekend.
It's going to be great.
So our headlining work, shall we say, with our guest violinist Rachel Barton-Pine is the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto in E minor. Mendelssohn was quite the prodigy.
That's right. He was the child prodigy of all child prodigies. He was really the real deal in that sense. His family was very wealthy. He was born 1809 in Hamburg. He moved to Berlin with his family 3 years later. His mother was a musician and artist. She was a student of French, English, Italian literature. She read Homer in the original Greek. Mendelssohn's father was cultured and literate. And these parents directly supervised the education of their children. Felix Mendelssohn, as a young child, would wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning and he would study music and history, Greek, Latin, natural science, contemporary literature, drawing. And he thrived on this regimen and he kept it going throughout his entire life.
Did little Felix have any siblings?
He had a very talented sister named Fanny Mendelssohn. This girl was described as having Bach fugue fingers because her fingers were very long and she was able to play the keyboard very expertly. In fact, by the time she was 13 years old, she had memorized the entire Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach.
Goodness. But Felix was definitely a prodigy himself.
That's right. He gave performances on piano in public at a very young age. His parents, however, had doubts about music as a career for him. It turns out that he was too good to stop it. It just wasn't going to be in the cards that Felix Mendelssohn would not be a composer of great music. By the time he was age 16, he had written 4 operas, a number of concertos, some symphonies, some cantatas, choral works, piano works. He was already working as a composer by 16 years old.
Gosh, so that means that young Mendelssohn got to hear his work performed.
That's right, because his family had the resources to carry that off. So he would write music and then he would get to try it out with orchestras and musicians that were hired in to play this music by his parents. So because of that, writing something down and then being able to hear an orchestra play it, he turned into this flawless technician. He knows everything about orchestration and basically how to write for different kinds of ensembles. It wasn't just the writing, it made him a good conductor as well because he could lead these groups through these performances. You have to compare that to almost all other composers, even famous ones like Charles Ives. They write music that they never get to hear what it sounds like with an orchestra. In today's world, there are computer programs that can give you an idea of what something is going to sound like. But Mendelssohn is really the only famous composer who had such unparalleled access to an ensemble to play his music as he wrote it. Even Mozart, who wrote a lot of music, didn't get to hear it performed as often as he might have liked.
So something you said just there, it sounds like Mendelssohn was quite particular about orchestration.
That's right. Deciding who's going to play what part of the music and in what combination at what time. Basically assigning melodies or harmonies or rhythms to different instruments. That is a really important part of composing a piece of music. He used a formula which has been described as the golden mean, which means exactly what you might think. He used exactly what had to be used for each little part of the orchestration and never anything more. It's very economical, very taut, very tight. And he used taste. He had very good taste, he had very good skill, and he had very good imagination as his approach to orchestrating his music. That's why it all sounds so nice.
And what about this concerto we're going to hear this weekend?
Well, all of those things, Mendelssohn's taste and his skill and his imagination, they're all on display in this violin concerto, not just for the violinist, but for the orchestra as well. It took him 6 years to write this piece, which is an unusually long time, especially for Mendelssohn. But now it is considered a bulwark of the violin repertoire. There's lots of serious violinists in the world, and they all come to terms with this piece sooner or later at some point in their career. Although the concerto consists of 3 movements and sort of this standard fast, slow, fast development, each movement follows a traditional form, so it sounds like a pretty normal piece, but when you listen to it, you can hear that there's some novel features involved in this music. It's a very innovative piece. There are things like the immediate entrance of the violin at the beginning of the piece. Now, to our ear, that doesn't sound so wild, but in those days, and as you can remember from other concertos, the orchestra usually plays for a little while first, or presents a theme or some kind of introduction before the soloist comes in. Not so in Mendelssohn's violin concerto. The violin is in at the very top.
It sounds like this piece is pretty secure in its place in the repertoire.
Yes, many violinists have recorded this concerto. It's performed in concerts and classical music competitions all over the world. It has also influenced the concertos of other composers who adopted aspects of Mendelssohn's work into their own concertos.
Do you have any other examples of composers using things from this concerto?
Sure, there's a very unusual placement of a violin cadenza when the violinist plays a solo while the orchestra is not playing. This happens before the recapitulation in the piece, and this was picked up by Tchaikovsky. He adopted this method of placement of the cadenza and used it in his own violin concerto. Also, Jean Sibelius borrowed this trick from Mendelssohn. So some of the things Mendelssohn did were picked up quickly by other composers.
And has this piece always been very popular among Mendelssohn's works?
The concerto was an instant success, and it was very warmly received at its premiere, and contemporary critics love it as well. So there's really never been a downtime for the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. By the end of the 19th century, the piece was already considered to be one of the greatest violin concertos in the repertoire, and it would later become one of Mendelssohn's most popular pieces, and as I said before, it's still regularly performed all over the place. In fact, the year before Mendelssohn's death, the celebrated violinist Joseph Joachim told the guests at his 75th birthday party, "The Germans have 4 violin concertos. The greatest and most uncompromising is Beethoven's. The one by Brahms vies with it in its seriousness. The richest and most seductive was written by Max Bruch, but the most inward and the heart's jewel is Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto."
Well, it will be a real treat to hear this wonderful piece performed by the incomparable Rachel Barton Pine this weekend.
That's right, and joined by the Symphony, we will have our heart's jewel.
Thank you so much for tuning in early. Please enjoy the show.